The wrench slipped from Margaret Chen's oil-stained fingers as the hangar door rattled open. She didn't need to look up from the Cessna's engine to know who was walking across the concrete floor. The measured footsteps and expensive leather shoes gave Director Harrison away. "Margaret." His voice carried the same patronizing tone she'd heard for the past 6 months. "We need to talk." She wiped her hands on her coveralls and straightened, her 62-year-old frame protesting after 3 hours bent over the engine. "Compartment. If this is about the Henderson rescue last week, I already filed my report." "It's not about your report." Harrison's pale eyes swept over her grease-stained appearance with obvious distaste. "It's about your future with Mountain Air Rescue." Margaret's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this conversation ever since the board meeting last month, when whispers about aging pilots and liability concerns had reached her ears through the aviation grapevine. "I'm listening." Harrison pulled out a manila folder, his movements deliberate and cold. "The board has made a decision. Effective immediately, you're being transitioned to a ground-based administrative role. No more flight operations." The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret gripped the edge of the workbench, her knuckles white. "Administrative? You mean desk work? Training new pilots, coordinating rescue operations, managing equipment maintenance, all vital roles that utilize your experience without the risks associated with what?" Margaret's voice rose. "Say it, Harrison." "The risks associated with being old." His face flushed. "With pilots who may not have the reflexes or judgment required for emergency situations. The Henderson rescue was a perfect example. You took unnecessary risks that could have resulted in multiple casualties. I saved 3 lives. You violated protocol by flying in weather conditions that should have grounded any reasonable pilot." The review board was very clear about their concerns. Margaret's mind flashed back to that storm-lashed evening 2 weeks ago. The hikers trapped on Devil's Peak, hypothermia setting in, weather window closing fast. She'd made the call that her younger colleagues couldn't or wouldn't make. Now they were using her decision to ground her permanently. "I've been flying rescue missions for 37 years, she said quietly. "I've logged more mountain rescue hours than any pilot in this region. I know these peaks better than pilots half your age." Harrison's interruption was sharp. "That's exactly the attitude that concerns us. You're living in the past, Margaret. Modern aviation requires updated skills, current training protocols, and pilots who can adapt to new safety standards." She wanted to argue, to fight back with statistics and experience logs, but the folder in Harrison's hands told her the decision was already made. The corporate takeover of Mountain Air Rescue 6 months ago had brought new management, new policies, and apparently new age limits. "What if I refuse?" "Then you'll be terminated, with cause." Harrison's voice softened slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "Take the administrative position, Margaret. It's a good retirement package, full benefits, and you'll still be part of the team." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind whistling through the hangar's metal framework. Margaret looked past Harrison to the aircraft lined up in the hangar, 2 helicopters, 3 fixed-wing planes, and her beloved Cessna 185 taildragger that had been her partner in countless rescues. "I need time to think about it. You have until tomorrow morning. The paperwork needs to be filed by noon." Harrison turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Margaret, everyone recognizes your contributions. But times change. The insurance company won't cover pilots over 60 for high-risk operations. It's not personal, it's business." After he left, Margaret stood alone in the hangar, the familiar smells of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid suddenly foreign in her nostrils. She'd known this day would come eventually, but she'd always imagined it would be her choice. Her timing. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Sarah. "How's the old bird today?" Still terrorizing the mountains? Margaret smiled despite herself. Sarah was 34, a successful architect in Denver, and had been trying to convince her mother to retire and move closer to the grandkids for years. Maybe Harrison was right. Maybe it was time to accept that her flying days were over. She walked to her Cessna and ran her hand along the wing strut. The plane was 23 years old, but maintained to perfection. Every rivet, every cable, every instrument had been checked and rechecked under her supervision. She knew this aircraft better than she knew her own reflection. The radio crackled to life in the corner of the hangar, breaking her reverie. Mountain Air Rescue, this is the Search and Rescue Command. We have a priority emergency situation developing. Please respond. Margaret moved to the radio without thinking, her training taking over. This is Mountain Air Rescue, Margaret Chen responded. Go ahead, Command. Margaret, thank God you're there. We have a missing aircraft situation. Twin-engine Beechcraft, 4 souls on board, overdue by 3 hours on a flight from Denver to Aspen. Last contact was over the Continental Divide, somewhere in the Fraser River Valley area. Margaret's pulse quickened. The Fraser River Valley was treacherous terrain, high peaks, narrow valleys, and weather that could change from clear to deadly in minutes. What's the weather situation? Deteriorating fast. We've got a storm system moving in from the west, expected to hit the area within the next 2 hours. Ground teams are staging, but with the terrain and weather, air search is our only option. For initial location, copy that. I'll prep for Actually, Margaret, I need to clarify something. I was told to request pilots Anderson or Martinez for any emergency calls. Are either of them available? Margaret's jaw tightened. Anderson was 28 with minimal mountain experience. Martinez was competent, but had only been with the company for 8 months. Neither had her knowledge of the Fraser River Valley's hidden dangers. Both pilots are off duty, she said, which was technically true. I can be airborne in 15 minutes. Stand by, Mountain Air Rescue. Margaret used the pause to check the weather radar on her tablet. The storm system was massive, moving faster than predicted. If someone was down in that valley, they had maybe 90 minutes before the weather made rescue impossible. Mountain Air Rescue, this is Command. We're going to hold off on air search until weather conditions improve. Ground teams will handle the initial response. Command, that's a mistake. By the time this storm passes, anyone down there will be dealing with freezing temperatures and potential avalanche conditions. We need to search now. Negative, Mountain Air Rescue. Orders are to wait for improved conditions and daylight operations with primary pilots. Margaret stared at the radio, fury building in her chest. 4 people were out there, possibly injured, definitely in danger, and the bureaucracy was going to let them die because she was too old to fly. She made a decision that would change everything. Command, this is Margaret Chen, pilot in command. I'm declaring this an emergency situation requiring immediate response. I'll be airborne in 10 minutes. Margaret, wait, you don't have authorization for... She switched off the radio and began her pre-flight checklist. The Cessna's engine turned over smoothly, settling into its familiar rhythm. Margaret taxied out of the hangar, her hands steady on the controls despite her racing heart. As she lined up on the runway, her phone rang. Harrison's number flashed on the screen. She let it go to voicemail and pushed the throttle forward. The Cessna lifted off into the gathering darkness, climbing toward the mountains where 4 lives hung in the balance. Margaret had made her choice. She was going to save them or die. Trying. And if the bureaucrats wanted to fire her for it, they could damn well try. What do you think will happen next? Share your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories. The turbulence hit Margaret's Cessna like a giant fist, slamming her against the restraints and rattling every rivet in the aircraft. She fought the controls, her weathered hands steady despite the violence of the storm that had arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule. Jesus, she muttered, checking her instruments. The altimeter was dancing wildly, the artificial horizon tilting at impossible angles as the mountain winds tried to tear her aircraft apart. She'd flown in rough weather before, but this was beyond anything she'd experienced in the Fraser River Valley. Through the windscreen, lightning illuminated the jagged peaks in stark black and white snapshots. The missing Beechcraft was somewhere down there, and with each passing minute, the chances of finding survivors diminished. Her radio crackled with static. "Garrett, this is Durson. Where the hell you?" She keyed the microphone, shouting over the engine noise. "Anderson, this is Margaret. I'm in the Fraser River Valley conducting search operations. Told you to stand down." The weather, another lightning flash, closer this time, and Margaret's instruments went haywire for a moment. When they stabilized, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her GPS showed her position directly over Grizzly Ridge, one of the most dangerous sections of the valley. "Anderson, I'm losing comms due to the weather." Continuing search pattern. She switched to the emergency frequency and began broadcasting. "Aircraft in distress. This is Mountain Air Rescue on 121.5. If you can hear this transmission, please respond." Nothing but static. Margaret dropped to a lower altitude, using her intimate knowledge of the valley to navigate by landmarks she could barely see through the storm. She'd flown this route hundreds of times, in every kind of weather, but never in conditions this severe. The Cessna bucked and rolled as she flew through a gap between two peaks, the wingtips seemingly close enough to touch the granite walls. Her daughter's voice echoed in her mind. "Mom, you're not invincible. You need to think about slowing down." Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe Harrison was right. Maybe she was too old for this. Then she saw it, a brief flash of metal reflecting her. Landing light, tucked into a narrow valley she recognized as Bear Creek Canyon. Her heart leaped as she banked the Cessna for a closer look. The Beechcraft was there, inverted against the canyon wall, its right wing crumpled like paper. But the fuselage appeared intact, and she could see tracks in the snow leading away from the wreckage. "Survivors." Margaret keyed her radio. "Mountain Air Rescue Base, this is Margaret. I have located the missing aircraft. Bear Creek Canyon, approximately 2 miles north of the old mining road. The aircraft is inverted, but the fuselage appears intact. I can see tracks indicating survivors." "Static," answered her. She tried again, switching to different frequencies, but the storm was blocking all communications. She was on her own, with 4 people somewhere in that canyon, and weather conditions that were rapidly becoming unflyable. The smart thing would be to mark the location and return to base. Let the ground crews handle the rescue in the morning. That's what any reasonable, safety-conscious pilot would do. Instead, Margaret began searching for a place to land. Bear Creek Canyon was less than a quarter-mile wide, with a small clearing that might be long enough for a short field. Landing. She'd done it before, years ago, in much better weather. But that was when she was 45, with reflexes that didn't hesitate and eyes that didn't need reading glasses. Another lightning strike illuminated the canyon, and she saw them, 4 figures huddled near a small fire, one apparently lying motionless on the ground. They were alive, but from their movements, at least one was seriously injured. Margaret made her decision. She circled the canyon once more, memorizing every detail of the improvised landing strip. The clearing was maybe 800 feet long, with trees at both ends and a slight uphill slope. In good conditions, it would be challenging. In this storm, it was borderline suicidal. She lined up for her approach, dropping flaps and bleeding off airspeed. The Cessna shuddered in the crosswind, and she fought to keep it aligned with the narrow clearing. The trees loomed ahead there, branches whipping in the wind like grasping fingers. 50 feet, 40-30. The downdraft hit her just as she crossed the tree line, slamming the aircraft toward the ground. Margaret pulled back on the yoke, feeling the stall buffet in the controls. The Cessna hung in the air for a moment, balanced on the edge of disaster. Then the wheels touched down. The landing was harder than she'd intended, bouncing once before settling onto the rough ground. She stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft slide on the wet earth. The far tree line rushed toward her, windscreen 20 feet from the trees. The Cessna finally stopped. Margaret sat in the sudden silence, her hands shaking as the adrenaline hit her system. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Through the storm, she could see the survivors moving toward her aircraft. One was supporting another, while a third struggled to carry someone who appeared unconscious. As they got closer, she could see they were all young, probably in their 20s or 30s. She shut down the engine and climbed out, immediately soaked by the freezing rain. The wind tried to knock her over, but she braced herself and ran toward the group. "Are you okay?" She shouted over the storm. The man in the lead was bleeding from a head wound, but his eyes were alert. "Thank God you found us. I'm Jake Morrison, pilot of the downed aircraft. We have 2 injured, my passenger. Lisa has a broken leg, and David is unconscious. Possible head injury." Margaret quickly assessed the situation. 4 people, 2 seriously injured, and weather conditions that made immediate evacuation impossible. Her Cessna could carry 3 passengers maximum, and with the injured, it would be a tight fit. "I'm Margaret Chen, Mountain Air Rescue. We need to get you to a hospital, but I can't take off in this weather." "We'll have to wait for it to pass." Jake's face fell. "How long?" Another lightning strike illuminated the canyon, and Margaret saw something that made her stomach drop. About half a mile up the canyon, a wall of white was moving toward them, a ground blizzard driven by the storm winds. "Not long enough," she said grimly. "We need to get everyone into the aircraft, now." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Margaret helped Jake and the 4th passenger, a young woman named Amy, carry the injured into the Cessna. Lisa was conscious but in obvious pain, while David remained unconscious, his breathing shallow. As they worked, Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities. Taking off in these conditions would be dangerous enough with just herself aboard. With 4 passengers, 2 of them injured, the aircraft would be overloaded and difficult to control, but staying on the ground wasn't an option either. The blizzard would bury them within hours, and the injured needed immediate medical attention. "Everyone strapped in?" she called back. "Ready," Jake replied, his voice tight with pain and fear. Margaret started the engine and began her taxi to the downhill end of the clearing. The wind was howling now, and she could barely see the trees at the end of the improvised runway. This takeoff would be the most dangerous of her career. Overloaded aircraft, storm conditions, short runway, and injured passengers depending on her skill and judgment. As she lined up for takeoff, Margaret heard Harrison's voice in her head. "Pilots who may not have the reflexes or judgment required for emergency situations." She pushed the throttle forward and proved him wrong. The Cessna lurched forward through the mud and snow, struggling against the extra weight and howling crosswinds. Margaret felt every vibration through the controls as the aircraft fought to gain speed on the treacherous surface. 30 knots. 40. The trees at the end of the clearing loomed larger through the windscreen, their branches thrashing like demons in the storm. "Come on, girl," Margaret whispered to the aircraft. "You can do this." Behind her, Lisa moaned in pain as the rough ground jarred her broken leg. David remained unconscious, his breathing concerned in the thin mountain air. Jake was trying to keep pressure on his head wound while monitoring his unconscious friend. 50 knots. The airspeed indicator climbed with agonizing slowness. Margaret knew she needed at least 60 knots to clear the trees, but the soft ground was acting like a brake on the overloaded aircraft. The tree line was rushing toward them now, filling the windscreen. Margaret made a split-second decision and pulled back on the yoke, lifting the Cessna off the ground while still below normal takeoff speed. The aircraft shuddered on the edge of a stall. Margaret held her breath as they skimmed over the treetops, branches scraping the landing gear. Then they were clear, climbing slowly into the storm-torn sky. "Holy shit," Jake breathed from the back seat. "I can't believe you just did that." Margaret was too busy fighting the controls to respond. The turbulence was worse than before, and the added weight made the aircraft sluggish and difficult to control. Every gust of wind threatened to flip them over or slam them into the canyon walls. She climbed carefully, using her knowledge of the local terrain to navigate between the peaks. The GPS was useless in these conditions, jumping between readings. As the storm interfered with the satellite signals, she was flying by instinct and 37 years of experience. "How's David?" She called back. Amy, who had some medical training, checked his pulse and breathing. "Pulse is weak but steady. We need to get him to a hospital soon." Margaret nodded, concentrating on keeping the aircraft level as they flew through a particularly violent downdraft. The nearest hospital was in Granby, about 20 minutes away in good weather. In this storm, it might as well be on the moon. Her radio crackled with static. "Garrett, this is Mountain Air Rescue Base. Please respond." She keyed the microphone. "Mountain Air Rescue Base, this is Margaret. I have 4 survivors aboard, 2 seriously injured. Requesting immediate emergency medical assistance at Granby Airport. Margaret, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for hours. What's your position?" "About 15 miles south of Granby, but the weather is deteriorating rapidly." "I'm not sure I can make it to the airport. Stand by, Margaret. We're contacting Granby Tower and EMS." Another voice cut in Harrison's. "Margaret, this is Director Harrison. You are ordered to return to base immediately. You have violated direct orders and put lives at risk." Margaret felt her anger flare. "I have 4 survivors aboard, including 2 with serious injuries. I'm not abandoning them to save your insurance premiums. You're flying an overloaded aircraft in weather conditions beyond safe limits. You're risking 6 lives instead of 4. Then maybe you should have sent a competent pilot instead of leaving me to clean up your mess." The radio fell silent except for static. Margaret immediately regretted her words. She'd probably just ended her career, but her focus had to be on getting her passengers to safety. The next few minutes were a nightmare of turbulence and navigation. Margaret fought to keep the aircraft level while following the valley toward Granby. The storm seemed to be getting worse, if that was possible, with wind shear that threatened to tear the wings off the overloaded Cessna. "Margaret," Jake called from the back. "David's breathing is getting worse. Amy thinks he might have a brain bleed." The urgency in his voice made Margaret's decision for her. She pushed the throttle forward, trading altitude for speed. The aircraft screamed through the storm, bucking and rolling like a wild horse. Through the rain and snow, she caught glimpses of lights ahead Granby. But as they got closer, she realized the airport was completely. The runway lights were invisible through the storm, and the wind was gusting at nearly 50 knots. Her radio crackled to life. "Mountain Air Rescue 185, this is Granby Tower. We have emergency vehicles standing by, but current conditions are below landing minimums. Wind is gusting to 48 knots with visibility near zero." Margaret stared at the instruments, her mind racing. She could try to land, but with the overloaded aircraft and crosswind conditions, the chances of success were minimal. A crash landing would likely kill everyone aboard, or she could try to fly to Denver, another hour away, and hope the weather improved. But David might not have an hour. "Granby Tower, I'm declaring an emergency. I have critical injuries aboard and need immediate landing clearance." "Roger, 185. You're cleared to land on any runway. Emergency vehicles are standing by." Margaret began her descent, using the airport's navigation beacon to guide her through the storm. The wind was pushing the aircraft sideways, and she had to crab into the crosswind to maintain her course. At 500 feet, she still couldn't see the runway. The aircraft was being tossed around like a toy, and she was fighting to keep it under control. Behind her, Lisa was crying in pain, and Amy was trying to keep David conscious. 300 feet. Still no runway in sight. 200 feet. Margaret's hands were cramping from gripping the controls so tightly. 100 feet. She was about to execute a missed approach when she saw them, the approach lights, barely visible through the storm. She lined up with the runway, fighting the crosswind that tried to push her off course. The aircraft touched down hard, bouncing. Once before settling onto the wet asphalt, Margaret stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft slide on the slick surface. They came to a stop just as the emergency vehicles surrounded them, their red and blue lights flashing through the storm. Paramedics were already pulling the injured from the aircraft before Margaret had even shut down the engine. As David was loaded onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "You did good, pilot. That kid probably wouldn't have made it another hour." Margaret nodded, suddenly exhausted. She watched as the ambulances disappeared into the storm, their sirens fading into the wind. Her radio crackled one more time. "Margaret, this is Harrison. Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your future with this company." She looked at the Cessna, still intact despite the punishment it had taken. They'd both proven something tonight that experience and skill mattered more than age or corporate policies. "Copy that, Harrison," she said quietly. "I'll be there." But as she walked into the terminal, Margaret was already planning her next move. Harrison wanted to ground her? Fine. She'd show him and the entire aviation industry that Margaret Chen wasn't ready for the hangar just yet. The storm was beginning to clear, and through the terminal windows, she could see the first stars appearing in the night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, 4 people were alive because an old pilot had refused to stay grounded. The tension is building. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which character you're rooting for. Your support helps me create more incredible stories like this one. Margaret's hands shook as she poured her 3rd cup of coffee at 5:30 a.m. She barely slept, replaying the rescue mission over and over in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Cessna skimming those treetops and felt the aircraft shudder on the edge of a stall. The local news was already running the story. Veteran pilot defies orders, saves 4 lives in daring mountain rescue. The reporter called her a hero, but Margaret knew Harrison would see it differently. Her phone had been ringing all night. Reporters, other pilots, even her daughter Sarah calling from Denver. She'd ignored most of them, but Sarah's voicemail had been impossible to avoid. "Mom, I saw the news. Please call me. I'm worried sick." Margaret walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the mountains where she'd nearly died just hours ago. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear morning that mocked the previous night's violence. At 7:45 a.m., she arrived at the Mountain Air Rescue headquarters. The parking lot was fuller than usual, with several news vans and unfamiliar vehicles. As she walked toward the building, a reporter thrust a microphone in her face. "Miss Chen, how do you respond to critics who say you put lives at risk with your unauthorized flight?" Margaret pushed past without answering. Inside, she could see Harrison's office door was closed, but she could hear voices, multiple voices, all speaking at once. "Margaret!" She turned to see Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the chief medical officer from Granby Hospital, walking toward her with a smile. "I wanted to thank you personally. David Morrison is going to make a full recovery because you got him to us in time. Another hour, and we might have lost him." "How are the others?" "Lisa's leg is set and healing well. Jake needed 12 stitches, but he's fine. Amy wasn't injured, just shaken up." Dr. Rodriguez paused. "They all want to thank you. They know you saved their lives." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. I was just doing my job. No, you were doing a lot more than that. You were a pilot. Before Margaret could respond, Harrison's office door opened. He emerged with 3 men in expensive suits, corporate types, probably from the insurance company or parent corporation. Margaret, Harrison's voice was cold. In my office now. She followed him inside, noting that the 3 suited men remained. In the hallway, Harrison closed the door and gestured to a chair across from his desk. I assume you've seen the news coverage, he began without preamble. Hard to miss. Do you understand the position you've put this company in? You violated direct orders, operated outside established protocols, and endangered lives with a reckless flight in conditions that should have grounded any rational pilot. Margaret felt her temper rising. I saved 4 lives. You got lucky. That's not the same thing. Harrison opened a file folder. The insurance company is threatening to cancel our coverage. The parent corporation is demanding answers. And the FAA is launching an investigation into your flight operations. The FAA. Someone filed a complaint alleging that you operated an aircraft in an unsafe manner, violated weather minimums, and exceeded aircraft weight limits. They want to review your medical certification and consider suspension of your license. Margaret's blood ran cold. Without her pilot's license, she couldn't fly anywhere, for anyone. Who filed the complaint? Harrison's silence was answer enough. You son of a bitch, Margaret said quietly. You reported me to the FAA. I reported a pilot who has become a liability to this organization and the aviation community. Your actions last night were those of someone who no longer has the judgment required for safe flight operations. Margaret stood up, her hands clenched into fists. My actions last night saved 4 lives that would have been lost if I'd followed your precious protocols. David Morrison would be dead right now if I'd waited for your approved pilots to wake up and check the weather. And you might have killed 6 people instead of saving 4. You flew an overloaded aircraft in conditions that violated every safety regulation in the book. You put your passengers at risk, you put yourself at risk, and you put other aircraft at risk. I made a calculated decision based on 37 years of experience and intimate knowledge of that terrain. Something your 20-something pilots don't have. Your 37 years of experience don't change the laws of physics or the FOE relations. You're not above the rules, Margaret, no matter how many people call you a hero. Margaret stared at him, seeing the fear behind his anger. He was scared of the insurance company, scared of the corporate bosses, scared of anyone who might threaten his comfortable position. So what happens now? You're suspended pending the FAA investigation. No flying, no access to aircraft, no contact with rescue operations. If the investigation goes against you, you'll be terminated. And if it doesn't, then you'll be offered the administrative position we discussed yesterday. Take it or leave it. Margaret looked around the office, noting the corporate motivational posters and safety awards on the walls. Everything about this place had changed since the takeover. The soul of the operation had been replaced by spreadsheets and liability concerns. I'll take my chances with the FAA, she said. Harrison nodded. Clean out your locker. Security will escort you off the property. As Margaret gathered her personal items from her locker, she was surprised to find several of the younger pilots waiting for her. Anderson, the pilot who'd been on the radio during her rescue flight, stepped forward. Margaret, I want you to know that most of us don't agree with what Harrison's doing. You saved those people's lives, and you did it with more skill than any of us could have managed. Thanks, Anderson. That means a lot. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice. I've been flying for mountain air for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did last night. I couldn't have made that landing in Bear Creek Canyon, not in those conditions. Margaret looked at the young pilot, seeing something in his eyes that reminded her of herself at that age. You could have if you'd had to. That's what being a pilot means, doing what needs to be done, even when it's scary. Will you fight the FAA investigation? Damn right I will. As security escorted her to her truck, Margaret felt the weight of what she'd lost. Mountain Air Rescue had been her home for 15 years, her purpose for getting up every morning. Now she was persona non grata, branded as a reckless pilot who'd put lives at risk. But as she drove away from the headquarters, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Jake Morrison's number. Ms. Chen, this is Jake Morrison. I wanted to thank you again for what you did last night. You saved our lives. You're welcome, Jake. I'm glad everyone's okay. I heard about what happened at your company. That's bullshit, if you'll pardon my language. You're the best pilot I've ever seen. And what you did took more courage and skill than those corporate types will ever understand. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. I appreciate that, Jake. I have a proposition for you. I run a small charter operation out of Denver. It's nothing fancy, but we could use a pilot with your experience. Interested? Margaret pulled over to the side of the road, her heart racing. I'm facing an FAA investigation. I might lose my license. From what I saw last night, you're exactly the kind of pilot we need, someone who puts lives before regulations. Think about it. After Jake hung up, Margaret sat in her truck for a long time, staring at the mountains that had been her workplace. For so many years, Harrison and his corporate bosses might have grounded her, but they couldn't ground her spirit. She had one more fight left in her, and she was going to make it count. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Saw the news. So proud of you, Mom. Call me when you're ready to talk. Margaret smiled and started the engine. She had calls to make, lawyers to contact, and a reputation to defend. The FAA investigation would be a battle, but she'd faced worse odds before. As she drove toward Denver, Margaret Chen began planning her comeback. They'd called her too old to fly, but she was about to prove that experience and determination could overcome any obstacle. The real adventure was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in a sterile conference room at the FAA's Denver office, facing a panel of 3 investigators. Her lawyer, Jim Patterson, sat beside her, his expensive suit contrasting with her simple blazer and slacks. Miss Chen, the lead investigator, a thin man named Warren, began. We've reviewed the flight data and witness statements from your rescue operation on October 15th. We need to discuss several violations of federal aviation regulations. Margaret kept her expression neutral. I'm listening. Let's start with 14 CFR 91.13, careless and reckless operation of an aircraft. You flew in weather conditions that were below VFR minimums, with visibility near zero and wind gusts exceeding 50 knots. I declared an emergency, Margaret replied calmly. Emergency authority allows deviation from normal regulations when necessary to save lives. Emergency authority doesn't give you carte blanche to violate basic safety principles, Warren countered. You also exceeded the aircraft's maximum gross weight by approximately 150 pounds, Jim leaned forward. My client had 4 injured people who needed immediate medical attention. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and waiting for improved conditions would have likely resulted in fatalities. The second investigator, a woman named Sarah Collins, spoke up. Ms. Chen, you have over 15,000 flight hours and an exemplary safety record. That's why this case is so concerning. Your actions that night were inconsistent with your training and experience. Margaret felt her patience wearing thin. My actions that night were consistent with my oath as a pilot to protect and preserve life. 4 people are alive today because I made the decision to fly. 4 people who might have been killed if your aircraft had crashed, Warren said. Your landing at Bear Creek Canyon was described by one witness as barely controlled. You touched down on an unprepared surface in a crosswind that exceeded the aircraft's demonstrated capability. I've landed in that canyon before. I knew the terrain, the wind patterns, the approach path. I made an informed decision based on 37 years of experience flying in those mountains. Collins consulted her notes. The weather service shows conditions deteriorating rapidly that evening. Surface winds at Granby Airport were gusting to 48 knots when you landed. That's well above safe limits for a Cessna 185. Safe limits are guidelines, not absolutes. A skilled pilot can operate beyond those limits when circumstances require it. Warren leaned back in his chair. Miss Chen, are you familiar with the concept of normalization of deviance? Margaret's lawyer shot her a warning look, but she answered anyway. Yes, it refers to the gradual acceptance of lower standards until dangerous practices become routine. Exactly. Your company filed a complaint alleging that you've been taking increasing risks over the past several years. Flying in marginal weather, pushing aircraft limitations, disregarding safety protocols. Margaret's anger flared. Harrison's complaint is motivated by corporate liability concerns, not safety. He wants to force out experienced pilots to reduce insurance costs. Nevertheless, Collins interjected, the pattern of behavior suggests a pilot who may be suffering from degraded judgment due to age-related factors. Age-related factors? Margaret's voice rose. I passed my last medical examination with flying colors. My vision, reflexes, and cognitive function are all within normal limits. Physical health is only part of the equation, Warren said. Psychological factors, overconfidence, risk tolerance, resistance to change can also affect flight safety. Jim Patterson finally spoke up. Gentlemen, lady, we're getting into speculation territory here. My client has documented evidence of her competence and decision-making ability. The rescue she performed required extraordinary skill and judgment. Or extraordinary luck, Warren replied. Margaret stood up abruptly. Luck? You think I got lucky threading a Cessna through mountain passes in a thunderstorm? Lucky landing on a 800-foot strip in a crosswind? Lucky navigating by dead reckoning when all my instruments were going crazy? Miss Chen, please sit down, Collins said. No, I've been flying for 37 years without a single accident or incident. I've saved hundreds of lives, trained dozens of pilots, and maintained aircraft to standards that exceed FAA requirements. And now you're questioning my judgment because I saved 4 more lives? Warren consulted his file. Your company also reported that you've been resistant to new training protocols and safety procedures. I've been resistant to corporate bureaucracy. That puts paperwork ahead of common sense. The new procedures you're talking about would have prevented that rescue mission entirely. Perhaps that would have been the appropriate outcome, Collins said quietly. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at the investigator, unable to believe what she'd just heard. Are you suggesting that 4 people should have died rather than risk 1 aircraft and 1 pilot? I'm suggesting that emergency services personnel must work within established safety frameworks, even when the outcome is tragic. Margaret felt something break inside her. These people, sitting in their comfortable offices, making decisions about life and death without ever having felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between someone and the grave. Have you ever seen someone die because help couldn't reach them in time? She asked quietly. Collins shifted uncomfortably. Miss Chen, that's not relevant to. It's completely relevant. I've seen it. A hiker who fell into a crevasse while I was grounded for maintenance. A family trapped in their car after an avalanche while I was waiting for weather clearance. A climber bled to death because it took ground rescue 6 hours to reach him. Margaret leaned forward, her voice intense. Every time I climb into that cockpit, I know I might not come back. But I also know that someone else might not come back either if I don't try. That's the burden of being a rescue pilot, and it's a burden I've carried with pride for 37 years. Warren made a note in his file. Miss Chen, we appreciate your dedication to saving lives. But regulations exist for a reason. They're written in blood, learned from accidents and tragedies that could have been prevented. And sometimes regulations become obstacles to the very thing they're supposed to protect: human life. The third investigator, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Miss Chen, what if you'd crashed that night? What if your decision to fly had resulted in 6 deaths instead of 4 saves? Margaret met his gaze steadily. Then I would have died trying to save lives, and I could live with that decision. What I can't live with is the idea of letting people die because I was too afraid to try. The investigators exchanged glances. Collins made a final note in her file. We'll take your statements under advisement, Warren said. You'll receive our decision within 30 days. As they filed out of the conference room, Jim Patterson squeezed Margaret's shoulder. You did well there. Passionate but controlled. How do you think it went? Honestly, it could go either way. They're clearly concerned about the regulatory violations, but your safety record speaks for itself. The fact that you saved 4 lives complicates their decision significantly. Margaret nodded, feeling drained. What happens if they suspend my license? We appeal. But Margaret, you need to prepare for the possibility that your flying days might be over. As they walked out of the building, Margaret's phone rang. Jake Morrison's name appeared on the screen. Margaret, I've been following the investigation. How did it go? I won't know for 30 days. Listen, I've been talking to some people in the aviation community. There's a lot of support for you out there. Other pilots who think what you did was heroic, not reckless. That's nice to hear, but it won't change the FAA's decision. Maybe not, but it might change something else. I've been putting together a coalition of pilots and aviation professionals who want to start a new rescue organization. One that values experience and judgment over corporate liability concerns. Margaret stopped walking. What kind of organization? Independent search and rescue. Contract work for counties and states that need our services. We'd be small, nimble, and focused on saving lives rather than protecting insurance companies. Jake, I might not have a license in 30 days, and you might. Either way, we could use your expertise in training and operations. Think about it. After Jake hung up, Margaret stood on the sidewalk, watching the Denver traffic flow past. Her future was uncertain, her career possibly over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of her flying career. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Dad would be proud of you, Mom. You did the right thing. Margaret smiled, thinking of her late husband who had been a pilot himself. He'd always said that the best pilots were the ones who never forgot why they started flying in the first place, to soar above the ordinary and touch the extraordinary. As she drove home, Margaret began to plan. If the FAA grounded her, she'd find another way to serve. If they let her keep her license, she'd use it to build something better than what she'd left behind. Either way, Margaret Chen wasn't finished with the sky. 2 weeks into the waiting period, Margaret was in her garage working on her personal aircraft, a restored 1968 Cessna 180, when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, tired of reporters and well-wishers, but the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Margaret Chen. Miss Chen, this is Captain Lisa Hayes, Colorado Air National Guard. I flew search and rescue for 12 years before joining the Guard. I heard about your situation. Margaret wiped her hands on a shop rag. What can I do for you, Captain? Actually, I'm calling to see what I can do for you. Jake Morrison contacted me about a new rescue organization you're considering. I'm interested. You'd leave the Guard? I'm considering it. The Guard does important work, but there are gaps in civilian search and rescue that need filling. What happened to you at Mountain Air Rescue could happen to any of us corporate interests pushing out experienced pilots. Margaret felt a familiar stirring of excitement. What did Jake tell you? That you're the best mountain pilot he's ever seen. and that you're being railroaded by bureaucrats who've never risked their lives to save others. He also said you saved his life and 3 others under conditions that would have killed a lesser pilot. Jake's a good man, but he might be exaggerating. I don't think so. I've reviewed the weather data from that night, and I've flown in those mountains myself. What you did was technically perfect and morally necessary. Margaret walked to her workbench where she'd spread out sectional charts of the Colorado mountains. Have you talked to other pilots about this? Several. There's a lot of interest in forming an independent organization. Pilots who are tired of corporate interference, former military aviators looking for meaningful work, even some younger pilots who want to learn from experienced professionals. It would be expensive. Insurance, aircraft, equipment, training. Jake's working on the funding. He has connections in the outdoor recreation industry, and there are several foundations that support search and rescue operations. The key is proving we can do the job better than the existing organizations. Margaret traced a route on one of the charts, following the path she'd taken during the rescue. What about regulatory approval? The FAA isn't exactly thrilled with me right now. That's actually working in our favor. The investigation has attracted attention from aviation professionals who think the current system is broken. There's talk of regulatory reform, maybe even congressional hearings. Congressional hearings? The Morrison family is connected in Washington. Jake's father is a federal judge, and his uncle is on the House Transportation Committee. They're not happy about how you've been treated. Margaret felt a chill of possibility. What exactly are you proposing? A meeting. Jake has arranged for a dozen pilots to get together next week in Denver. We want to discuss forming Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation, an independent, pilot-owned organization dedicated to saving lives. And if the FAA suspends my license, then we'll find other ways to use your expertise. Training, operations planning, equipment maintenance. A pilot isn't just someone who flies. They're someone who understands aviation. After Captain Hayes hung up, Margaret stood in her garage for a long time, staring at the sectional charts. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Mom, I'm proud of what you're doing. Dad would be too." The next morning, Margaret drove to Denver for the meeting. Jake had reserved a conference room at a hotel near the airport, and when she arrived, she found 12 pilots already assembled, a mix of military veterans, former airline pilots, and experienced mountain aviators. Margaret. Jake stood up as she entered. "Everyone, this is Margaret Chen, the pilot I've been telling you about." The introductions were quick but impressive. Captain Hayes from the Air National Guard. Bill Thompson, who'd flown helicopter rescues in Alaska. Maria Santos, who'd been a flight instructor for 20 years, and others with equally impressive credentials. "We've been discussing the state of search and rescue aviation in Colorado," Jake began once everyone was seated. "The corporate takeover of organizations like Mountain Air Rescue has created gaps in coverage and reduced the quality of service." Bill Thompson, a grizzled veteran in his 50s, spoke up. "I've been flying rescues for 30 years, and I've never seen the situation as bad as it is now. Pilots are being pushed out because of insurance concerns, not safety issues. The irony," added Maria Santos, "is that the most experienced pilots are the ones being grounded. The corporate types would rather have a 25-year-old with minimal experience than a 60-year-old with decades of mountain flying." Margaret listened as the discussion continued, feeling a growing sense of purpose. These pilots understood what she'd been through because they'd lived it themselves. "So what's the plan?" she asked. Jake pulled out a folder. "We incorporate as a non-profit organization dedicated to search and rescue operations. We contract with county and state agencies to provide services that the existing organizations can't or won't provide. Funding? I've already secured commitments from 3 outdoor gear companies who want to support mountain rescue. The Colorado Outdoor Recreation Association is interested in sponsoring us, and several private donors have expressed interest. Captain Hayes opened her laptop. I've been researching the regulatory requirements. We'd need to obtain commercial operating certificates, maintain insurance, and meet all FAA requirements. But as an independent organization, we have more flexibility than corporate-owned companies. What about aircraft? Margaret asked. That's where it gets interesting, Jake said. Several pilots have offered to lease their aircraft to the organization. Bill has a helicopter. I have the Beechcraft once it's repaired, and Maria has a Cessna 206. We could start with existing aircraft and expand as funding allows. Margaret felt her excitement building. What about training and standards? That's where we'd need your expertise, Jake said. We want to establish training programs that combine regulatory compliance with real-world experience. No more grounding experienced pilots because they don't follow corporate protocols. Bill Thompson leaned forward. Margaret, I've heard about your situation with the FAA. Are you willing to take the risk of joining something like this? Margaret looked around the room at the faces of pilots who dedicated their lives to saving others. I've been taking risks my whole career. The only difference is that now I'm taking them for something I believe in. Then you're in, I'm in. The next 3 hours were spent planning the details. They would call the organization Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation, with Jake as CEO and Margaret as Chief Pilot and Training Director. Captain Hayes would handle regulatory compliance, and Bill Thompson would manage helicopter operations. As the meeting broke up, Margaret felt more energized than she had in months. For the first time since the investigation began, she was looking forward to the future. Her phone rang as she was driving home. The caller ID showed her lawyer's number. Jim, what's the word? Mixed news, Margaret. The FAA has decided not to suspend your license. Margaret nearly swerved off the road. Seriously? They're issuing a formal reprimand for violating weather minimums and weight restrictions, but they're not suspending your commercial privileges. The fact that you saved 4 lives and had no accidents weighed heavily in their decision. That's incredible news. There's a catch, though. The reprimand goes on your permanent record, and it might affect your ability to get hired by commercial operators. Some companies won't touch pilots with FAA violations. Margaret smiled. That's not going to be a problem, Jim. I've got other plans. Oh, what kind of plans? The kind that involves flying rescue missions with pilots who understand that sometimes you have to break the rules to save lives. After Jim hung up, Margaret pulled over and called Jake with the news. His excitement was infectious. This is perfect timing, he said. We've just received approval for our nonprofit status, and 2 more pilots have expressed interest in joining. With your license intact, we can move forward with the training program immediately. When do we start? Next month. We've got our first contract with Grand County for winter mountain rescue operations. Think you're ready to get back in the air? Margaret looked up at the mountains, snow-capped and beautiful in the afternoon light. I've been ready my whole life. As she drove home, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. Harrison and his corporate bosses had tried to ground her, but they'd only succeeded in pushing her towards something better. Sometimes, the best adventures begin with the worst disasters. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the hangar of Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation, watching Maria Santos practice short-field landings in the organization's newest aircraft, a twin-engine Beechcraft Baron that Jake had convinced a donor to purchase. Looking good, Maria, Margaret said into her radio. Remember to keep your approach speed consistent through the flare. Copy that, Chief. This Baron handles like a dream compared to the old Cessna. Margaret smiled at the title. Chief Pilot and Training Director of Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation. It had a nice ring to it, and more importantly, it came with the authority to set standards based on experience rather than corporate liability concerns. The hangar buzzed with activity. Bill Thompson was conducting a pre-flight inspection on the helicopter, while two new pilots, both veterans with impressive credentials, worked on flight planning for the next day's training mission. "Margaret," Jake called from the office. "We've got a situation developing." She walked over to find Jake on the phone, his expression serious. "Copy that, Sheriff. We'll have aircraft airborne in 15 minutes. He hung up and turned to Margaret. 4 cross-country skiers overdue in the Eagle's Nest Wilderness. They were supposed to be back yesterday evening. The weather's deteriorating, and the ground teams can't reach the area until tomorrow." Margaret felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. "What's the weather situation?" "Overcast at 8,000 feet, visibility 5 miles, winds gusting to 25 knots. Marginal VFR conditions, but flyable. Aircraft availability?" "Baron's ready to go. Bill's helicopter is down for maintenance, and Maria's still in the air with the training flight." Margaret nodded. "I'll take the Baron, who's available for co-pilot. Captain Hayes just arrived. She's been itching to get back in the air since she left the Guard." 20 minutes later, Margaret was in the left seat of the Baron, running through her pre-flight checklist with Lisa Hayes beside her, the twin-engine. Aircraft was a significant upgrade from the Cessna she'd been flying, faster, more capable, and equipped with modern navigation systems. "Beautiful aircraft," Lisa commented as they taxied to the runway. "Jake has good taste in equipment. This Baron has enough range and payload to handle extended rescue operations. And a chief pilot who knows how to use it properly." Margaret keyed the radio. "Denver Tower, Colorado Mountain Rescue 27, ready for departure. Colorado Mountain. Rescue 27, cleared for takeoff. Winds 240 at 18, gusting to 25. The Baron lifted off smoothly, climbing into the overcast sky. Margaret marveled at the difference between this aircraft and the old Cessna she'd been flying for mountain air rescue. The Baron was stable, responsive, and equipped with weather radar that allowed her to navigate around the worst of the turbulence. "What's our search area?" Lisa asked, studying the sectional chart. "Eagle's Nest Wilderness, about 30 miles northwest of here. It's backcountry skiing terrain, challenging but not extreme. The missing party consists of 4 experienced skiers who should have been able to handle the conditions. Equipment failure? Injury? Could be anything. We'll start with their planned route and work outward from there." As they flew northwest, Margaret thought about how different this felt from her old job. Instead of corporate bureaucrats second-guessing her decisions, she had partners who trusted her judgment. Instead of flying aircraft that were barely maintained to minimum standards, she had equipment that was kept in perfect condition. "There," Lisa pointed through the windscreen. "Fresh tracks heading up that valley." Margaret banked the Baron for a closer look. Below them, a narrow valley stretched between 2 ridges, with ski tracks visible in the snow. The tracks led to a small alpine lake, where they could see 4 bright spots of color against the white landscape. "Survivors," Margaret sighed, keying the radio. "Eagle's Nest SAR. This is Colorado Mountain Rescue 27. We have visual contact with 4 individuals at the Alpine Lake, approximately 5 miles northeast of the main search area. Copy, 27. Are they mobile?" Margaret circled lower, studying the scene below. "Negative, they appear to be in a camp setup, but we can see someone waving at us. They're alive but may be unable to move. The weather's getting worse down here. Ground teams are still at least 6 hours out." Lisa was already studying the terrain. "There's a clearing about half a mile from their position. It's small, but it might be large enough for a landing." Margaret assessed the improvised landing zone. It was maybe 600 feet long, with trees at both ends and a slight slope. Not as challenging as Bear Creek Canyon, but still requiring precision. "Flying. Can we get them to the clearing?" she asked Lisa. "If they're mobile, yes. If someone's injured, it might be difficult." Margaret made her decision. Eagle's Nest SAR, this is 2-7. We're going to attempt a landing and evacuation. Please have medical personnel standing by at our base. Roger, 2-7. Be advised. That weather is deteriorating rapidly. We're getting reports of snow and reduced visibility throughout the search area. Margaret began her descent, using the Baron's flaps and landing gear to slow their approach. The clearing was smaller than she'd hoped, but the twin-engine aircraft's short-field capabilities made it manageable. Nice and steady, Lisa said, watching. The approach. You've got about 50 feet of clearance at both ends. The Baron touched down smoothly, rolling to a stop with room to spare. Margaret shut down the engines and grabbed the emergency medical kit from the cabin. Let's go see what we've got. The hike to the stranded skiers took 15 minutes through knee-deep snow. When they reached the lake, Margaret found 4 college-age skiers huddled around a small camp stove. One of them, a young woman, was clearly in distress. "Thank God you found us," said the apparent leader of the group. "I'm Dave. This is Sarah, Mike, and Jenny. Jenny hurt her ankle yesterday evening, and we couldn't continue." Margaret knelt beside Jenny, quickly assessing her condition. The ankle was swollen and discolored, but she seemed alert and responsive. "How's the pain level?" Margaret asked. "Pretty bad. I can't put any weight on it. We're going to get you out of here. Can you walk with assistance?" "I think so, if someone helps me." Margaret looked at the weather, noting that the clouds were getting lower and the wind was picking up. "We need to move quickly. The weather's deteriorating, and we have a narrow window to get airborne." The trip back to the Baron was slow, but manageable. Dave and Mike supported Jenny while Lisa helped carry their equipment. Margaret kept watch on the weather, noting that visibility was starting to decrease. "Everyone strapped in?" Margaret called back as she started the engines. "Ready to go," Dave replied. The takeoff was routine, but as they climbed away from the clearing, Margaret could see the storm system moving in from the west. They had maybe 30 minutes before the area would be completely socked in. "Nice work," Lisa said as they leveled off. "That was textbook search and rescue." "Thanks. It feels good to be doing this kind of work again. How's it different from your old job?" Margaret thought about the question as they flew back to Denver. "Trust, I guess. Nobody's second-guessing my decisions or worried about insurance liability. We're here to save lives, and everyone understands that sometimes that means taking calculated risks." The Baron makes a difference, too. This aircraft has capabilities that your old Cessna couldn't match. Equipment is important, but it's not everything. The most important thing is having people who trust your judgment and support your decisions. As they approached Denver, Margaret received a radio call from Jake. 2-7, how did it go? 4 souls rescued, 1 with a minor injury. Aided to base is 15 minutes. Outstanding work. We've got another call coming in, possible avalanche. Situation near Vale. Can you handle it? Margaret looked at Lisa, who nodded. We're ready. Copy that. We'll refuel and head to Vale. As they landed at the CMRA base, Margaret felt a satisfaction that had been missing from her work for years. This was what she'd become a pilot for, not to satisfy corporate bureaucrats or insurance companies, but to serve others in their time of need. "Margaret," Dave called as they helped Jenny out of the aircraft. "I just want to say thank you. You saved our lives today." "Just doing my job," Margaret replied, but she felt the familiar warmth that came with a successful rescue. Lisa squeezed her shoulder. "Ready for the next one?" Margaret looked at the Baron, already being refueled and prepared for the next mission. "Always." As they walked toward the operations center, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. Harrison and Mountain Air Rescue had tried to ground her, but they'd only succeeded in pushing her towards something better. At 62, Margaret Chen was having the best flying career of her life, 6 months after the formation of Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation. Margaret was reviewing training reports in her office when alarms began sounding throughout the building. She looked up to see Jake running toward her, his face pale with urgency. "Margaret, we have a major situation. Multiple aircraft down in the Rockies." She followed him to the operations center, where a large screen displayed a weather map showing a massive storm system moving across the Colorado mountains. Red dots marked the locations of aircraft in distress. "What happened?" Margaret asked. "The freak storm system moved in faster than predicted," Captain Hayes reported from the radio console. "We have at least 3 aircraft down, possibly more. A commercial airliner made an emergency landing in Denver, but we've got reports of a private jet missing near Aspen, a helicopter down in the Sawatch Range, and a training aircraft overdue from Colorado Springs." Margaret studied the map, her mind automatically calculating distances, weather patterns, and aircraft capabilities. "What resources do we have available?" "Barron's ready to go. The Cessna 206 is fueled and prepped, and Bill's helicopter is operational." "But the weather ... quotes Jake shook his head. "It's the worst storm system we've seen in 5 years. What about the other rescue organizations?" "Mountain Air Rescue has grounded all aircraft. They're calling it too dangerous to fly." Margaret felt a familiar fire building in her chest. "Too dangerous? There are people dying out there." "Margaret," Lisa Hayes said quietly, "the weather conditions are extreme. Winds are gusting to 60 knots, visibility is near zero in some areas, and there are reports of severe turbulence and icing. Then we'll have to be better than the weather." Margaret walked to the large sectional chart mounted on the wall, studying the terrain and weather patterns. 3 separate crash sites, scattered across 150 miles of some of the most challenging mountain terrain in North America. "We'll need to coordinate a multi-aircraft response," she said. "Bill, can your helicopter handle the Sawatch Range crash site?" "If the weather holds, yes. But I'll need to wait for a window in the storm. I'll take the Baron to the Aspen area to search for the missing jet." "Maria, can you take the 206 to Colorado Springs?" Maria Santos nodded. "The 206 can handle the conditions. But it's going to be a rough ride." Jake looked at the weather display. "Margaret, are you sure about this?" "The FAA has issued a ground stop for all non-emergency aircraft. We are emergency aircraft. This is exactly what we were created for." Margaret began her pre-flight planning, studying weather reports and calculating fuel requirements. The missing jet near Aspen was her primary concern, a Learjet with 6 passengers that had been en route from Denver to Los Angeles when it disappeared from radar. "Chief," Lisa Hayes approached her desk, "I'd like to fly co-pilot on the Baron." "Lisa, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You taught me that being a pilot means doing what needs to be done, even when it's scary. I'm not letting you fly into that storm alone." Margaret looked at the younger pilot, seeing something of herself in her determined expression. "All right. But this is going to be the most challenging flight of your career. I wouldn't expect anything less." 30 minutes later, Margaret was in the left seat of the Baron, running through her pre-flight checklist as the storm raged around them. The aircraft was being buffeted by wind even while parked, and she could see debris blowing across the runway. "Denver Tower, Colorado Mountain Rescue 27, requesting immediate departure for search and rescue operations." 27, Denver Tower. Be advised that current conditions are outside safe operating parameters. Winds are 240 at 35, gusting to 55. Visibility is 2 miles and blowing snow. Denver Tower, we have 6 souls in distress. Requesting emergency departure authorization. A long pause. 27, cleared for takeoff. Winds now 250 at 40, gusting to 60. Good luck. Margaret pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Baron surge down the runway. The aircraft wanted to weather vane into the wind, but she held it straight with rudder and aileron corrections. At rotation speed, She pulled back on the yoke and felt the Baron leap into the storm. The turbulence was immediate and violent. The aircraft was thrown around like a toy, climbing and diving without warning. Margaret fought to maintain control, her hands gripping the yoke so tightly her knuckles were white. "Jesus," Lisa breathed, watching the altimeter swing wildly. "I've never seen turbulence like this." "Welcome to mountain flying in a storm," Margaret said through gritted teeth. "It gets worse before it gets better." As they climbed toward their cruising altitude, Margaret used her decades of experience to read the weather patterns. The storm had cells of varying intensity, and she navigated between them like a slalom skier, finding pockets of relatively smooth air. "There," Lisa pointed to a break in the clouds ahead. "Clear air." Margaret adjusted their heading, using the weather radar to guide them around the worst of the turbulence. The Baron's twin engines provided a reassuring roar, and the aircraft's stability systems helped her maintain control. "Colorado Mountain Rescue 27, this is Denver Center. We have radar contact with you. Be advised that we're tracking severe weather cells throughout your route. Copy, Denver Center. We're picking our way through the storm. Any updates on the missing Learjet?" "Negative contact since their last transmission 40 minutes ago. Last known position was approximately 20 miles southeast of Aspen." Margaret altered course toward the search area, her mind already calculating the possibilities. The Learjet had been flying at 25,000 feet when it disappeared, well above the mountain peaks, but in the heart of the storm system. "What do you think happened?" Lisa asked. "Could be anything. Structural failure from turbulence, icing, engine failure, or they might have tried to land somewhere and crashed." As they approached the search area, Margaret began a systematic search. Pattern: flying at the lowest altitude she dared in the deteriorating conditions. The terrain below was a maze of peaks and valleys, all obscured by snow and clouds. "There," Lisa suddenly pointed through the windscreen. "Is that wreckage?" Margaret banked the Baron for a closer look. On a narrow ridge about 12,000 feet above sea level, she could see the scattered remains of an aircraft. The distinctive shape of a Learjet wing was visible among the debris. "That's them," Margaret said grimly. "No survivors from that impact." She marked the location on her GPS and continued the search pattern. If the Learjet had broken up in flight, there might be other debris fields with survivors. 20 minutes later, Lisa spotted something else. "Movement on that slope. Is that a person?" Margaret descended for a closer look, fighting the turbulence that tried to slam them into the mountainside. Through the swirling snow, she could see a figure in bright clothing waving at them. "We have survivors," she reported to Denver Center. "At least one person alive on the north slope of Mount Elbert." "Copy 27. Can you attempt a rescue?" Margaret studied the terrain below. The survivor was on a steep slope with no suitable landing area within miles. The nearest clearing was at least 2 miles away, through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Colorado Rockies. Negative on immediate rescue. We need ground teams or helicopter support. All ground teams are hours away due to weather. Helicopter support is not available. Margaret made a decision that would define her career. "Denver Center, I'm going to attempt a landing on the Forest Service Road about 2 miles from the survivor's position. It's not ideal, but it's our only option." 27. That road is not suitable for aircraft operations. It's suitable for everything we need it to be. Margaret began her descent toward the narrow mountain road, using every bit of her experience to judge the wind and terrain. The road was barely wide enough for the Baron, with trees on both sides and a slight curve that would make the approach challenging. "Margaret," Lisa said quietly, "this is crazy." "No," Margaret replied, lining up with the road. "This is being a pilot." The Baron touched down hard on the rough asphalt, bouncing once before settling onto the road. Margaret stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft slide on the wet surface. They came to a stop just 50 feet from where the road curved around a large boulder. "Incredible," Lisa breathed. "I can't believe you just did that." "Neither can I," Margaret admitted. "But we're not done yet. We need to get to that survivor." The hike through the snow was brutal. Margaret and Lisa fought their way up the steep slope, carrying emergency medical supplies and communication equipment. The wind was howling, and visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. After an hour of climbing, they found him, a man in his 40s, conscious but suffering from hypothermia and a badly broken arm. His name was Margaret Chen, and he was a software engineer from California. "Are you real?" he asked through chattering teeth. "Real as it gets," Margaret replied, checking his injuries. "We're going to get you out of here. The others we found." "The wreckage, I'm sorry." Robert's face crumpled. "My wife, my daughter, they were on the plane." Margaret felt the familiar weight of tragedy that came with rescue work. "I'm sorry for your loss. Right now we need to focus on getting you to safety." The trip back to the Barren took 2 hours, with Margaret and Lisa taking turns supporting Robert through the deep snow. By the time they reached the aircraft, all three were exhausted and nearly hypothermic. "Denver Center, this is 27. We have one survivor from the Learjet crash. Requesting immediate medical evacuation. Copy 27. Can you get to Denver?" Margaret looked at the weather, noting that conditions were actually improving slightly. "Affirmative. We'll be there in 30 minutes. The takeoff from the mountain road was even more challenging than the landing. Margaret used every inch of asphalt, pulling the Barren off the ground just as the road curved. The aircraft climbed slowly, heavy with fuel and passengers, fighting the mountain winds that tried to push them back down. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered from the back seat, watching the trees flash past the windows. "You people are insane." "Insane enough to save your life," Lisa replied, monitoring the engine instruments. The flight back to Denver was a nightmare of turbulence and weather, but Margaret's years of experience guided them through the worst of it. She found pockets of smoother air between the storm cells, threading the Barren through gaps in the weather that would have been invisible to less experienced pilots. "Denver Tower, Colorado Mountain Rescue 27, inbound with medical emergency. Requesting priority landing and ambulance." 27 Denver Tower, you're cleared for immediate approach. Medical personnel standing by. As they descended toward Denver, Margaret could see the lights of the city through the clearing storm. The Barren touched down smoothly, and within minutes Robert was being loaded into an ambulance. "You saved my life," he said as the paramedics prepared to transport him. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just get better," Margaret replied. "That's enough thanks." As the ambulance drove away, Jake appeared at her side. "How did it go?" "One survivor from the Learjet. The others didn't make it." "Jesus, what about the other crashes?" Bill found the helicopter crew 2 survivors, both injured but alive. Maria located the training aircraft. A student pilot made a forced landing in a field. He's shaken up, but okay. Jake nodded grimly. 3 successful rescues in the worst weather conditions we've seen all year. Not bad for a bunch of pilots who are supposedly too old to fly. Margaret looked at the Barren, its wings still coated with ice from the flight. "How's the aircraft?" "Lisa's already started the post-flight inspection. Preliminary check shows everything's in good shape. You put it through hell, but it held together." "Good aircraft, good maintenance, good crew," Margaret said. "That's what makes the difference." As they walked toward the hangar, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed Harrison's number from Mountain Air Rescue. "Margaret, it's Harrison. I heard about what you did today." "What do you want, Harrison?" "I wanted to apologize and to ask if you'd consider coming back to Mountain Air Rescue. We could use someone with your skills and experience." Margaret stopped walking. "You mean the same skills and experience you said made me a liability? That was a mistake." The board has reconsidered its position regarding experienced pilots. We're prepared to offer you a senior position, full benefits, and complete autonomy in flight operations. Too late, Harrison. I've found something better. Better? You're flying out of a converted hangar with a handful of aircraft. We have resources, equipment, corporate backing. You have corporate interference, liability concerns, and bureaucrats who've never risked their lives for anything. I have pilots who trust each other, aircraft that are maintained to standards that actually matter. Margaret hung up and turned to Jake. How many rescue calls have we handled this year? 87 successful rescues, with a safety record that's better than any organization in the region. And how many times have we been grounded by corporate policy? 0. Then we're exactly where we need to be. 3 weeks after the storm. Rescue. Margaret was in the CMRA hangar performing a routine inspection on the Baron when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up outside. She watched through the open hangar door as several people in business suits emerged, followed by a familiar figure in a military uniform. Margaret Chen? The man in uniform approached her, his bearing unmistakably military. I'm Colonel James Mitchell, Colorado Air National Guard. We need to talk. Margaret set down her wrench and wiped her hands on a shop rag. What can I do for you, Colonel? You can tell me how you managed to save 3 separate groups of people in weather conditions that grounded every other rescue organization in the state. Good pilots, good aircraft, good judgment. Colonel Mitchell smiled. That's what I was hoping you'd say. I'm here to offer you a contract. What kind of contract? The Guard needs experienced pilots for our search and rescue operations. We've been watching your organization, and we're impressed with your capabilities and safety record. Margaret looked past the colonel to the civilians waiting by the SUVs. Who are your friends? Representatives from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Colorado Department of Public Safety, and the National Transportation Safety Board. They're all interested in discussing partnerships with Colorado. Mountain Rescue Aviation, Jake, appeared at Margaret's elbow, having heard the conversation. Partnerships for what? Multi-agency search and rescue operations, Colonel Mitchell explained. Your organization has demonstrated capabilities that complement our existing resources. We'd like to formalize that relationship. One of the civilians stepped forward, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of a senior government official. Ms. Chen, I'm Director Sarah Palmer from FEMA. We've been reviewing your rescue operations, and we're interested in incorporating your techniques into our national search and rescue protocols. Our techniques? Your ability to operate in extreme weather conditions, your knowledge of mountain terrain, and your decision-making under pressure. We've analyzed your recent rescues, and they represent some of the most challenging operations we've seen in decades. Margaret felt a familiar skepticism. What do you want from us? Training, Director Palmer said simply. We want you to train our pilots and develop protocols for extreme weather search and rescue operations. We're prepared to offer significant funding and resources. Colonel Mitchell nodded. The Guard would provide aircraft, equipment, and personnel. Your organization would provide expertise and training. It's a win-win situation. Margaret looked at Jake, who was clearly intrigued by the possibilities. What about our independence? You'd maintain complete operational autonomy, Director Palmer assured her. We're not interested in corporate takeovers or bureaucratic interference. We want to learn from your successes. And if we refuse, then we'll continue to struggle with search and rescue operations in extreme conditions, and more people will die because we don't have the skills and knowledge that you've developed. Margaret considered the offer. Federal funding would allow them to expand their operations, purchase better equipment, and hire more pilots. But it also meant dealing with government bureaucracy and oversight. I need to discuss this with my team, she said finally. Of course. We'll be in Denver for the next 3 days. Take your time. After the officials left, Margaret called a meeting of all CMR-A pilots. They gathered in the small conference room adjacent to the hangar, a mix of military veterans and civilian aviators who had come together around a shared commitment to saving lives. "So what do you think?" Jake asked, after Margaret had explained the offer. "It's a lot of money," Maria Santos said. "We could expand our operations, maybe open a second base in the southern part of the state." "Money comes with strings," Bill Thompson warned. "Government contracts always do." Lisa Hayes leaned forward. "But it also comes with legitimacy." "Right. Now we're seen as a small, independent operation. A federal contract would establish us as a major player in search and rescue." "Margaret," Jake said, "what's your gut feeling?" Margaret looked around the room at the pilots who had become not just colleagues but friends. "My gut says we should be careful. We've built something special here, a culture of excellence without bureaucratic interference. We need to make sure we don't lose that." "But," Lisa prompted, "but we also have a responsibility to share what we've learned. If our techniques and training can save lives in other parts of the country, then we have an obligation to make that happen." Bill nodded slowly. "So we negotiate terms that protect our independence while allowing us to expand our mission." "Exactly," Margaret said. "We make it clear that we're partners, not employees. We maintain our standards, our culture, and our decision-making authority." Over the next 2 days, Jake and Margaret negotiated with the federal officials. The final agreement was better than Margaret had hoped: substantial funding for aircraft and equipment, expanded facilities, and the authority to establish training programs for other rescue organizations. "There's one more thing," Director Palmer said as they finalized the contract. "We'd like to nominate you for the National Search and Rescue Award." Margaret was surprised. "I'm not sure that's necessary." "It's necessary because you've redefined what's possible in search and rescue aviation. Your techniques and decision-making have saved dozens of lives and will save many more as we implement your training programs." Colonel Mitchell added, "The award comes with a significant cash prize and national recognition. It would help establish your organization as the premier search and rescue training facility in the country." Margaret looked at Jake, who was grinning broadly. "What do you say, Chief?" "I say we've got work to do." 6 months later, Margaret stood at the podium in the ballroom of the Denver Convention Center, looking out at an audience of pilots, emergency responders, and aviation officials. She was wearing her best suit, a far cry from the grease-stained coverall she preferred, but the occasion demanded formality. "When I started flying 38 years ago," she began, "I thought being a pilot meant mastering the technical aspects of flight, the instruments, the procedures, the regulations. I learned that being a pilot means something much more fundamental. It means taking responsibility for the lives in your care." The audience was silent, hanging on her words. Margaret had been reluctant to accept the keynote speaking engagement for the National Search and Rescue Conference, but Jake had convinced her that she had something important to say. "Last year, I was told I was too old to fly, too set in my ways, too willing to take risks, too resistant to change." The implication was that experience was a liability rather than an asset. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Many of them were older pilots who had faced similar challenges in their careers. But experience isn't just about the hours in your logbook. It's about the judgment that comes from facing difficult decisions, the wisdom that comes from learning from mistakes, and the courage that comes from knowing that sometimes the right choice is also the dangerous choice. Margaret clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of the Baron landing on the mountain road during the storm rescue. This landing was technically illegal. It violated multiple FAA regulations, exceeded the aircraft's operating parameters, and put lives at risk. It was also the only way to save a man who would have died from hypothermia if we had followed standard procedures. She clicked to another slide, showing the 4 survivors from her original rescue mission. This flight was conducted in weather conditions that should have grounded any reasonable pilot. I was criticized for taking unnecessary risks, for putting my passengers in danger, for violating established protocols. But 4 people are alive today because I made the decision to fly. Margaret looked directly at the audience. I'm not advocating for reckless behavior or ignoring safety regulations. I'm advocating for the kind of judgment that comes from experience, the willingness to take calculated risks when lives are at stake, and the courage to do what's right even when it's not easy. She clicked to a final slide, showing the CMRA team standing in front of their aircraft. Colorado Mountain Rescue Aviation has conducted over 200 successful rescues in the past year. We've trained pilots from 12 different organizations, and our techniques have been adopted by rescue services across the country. We've proven that experience and judgment are not liabilities, they're our greatest assets. The audience erupted in applause, and Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the stage lights. As she returned to her seat, she saw Harrison in the audience, applauding with the others. After the presentation, Harrison approached her at the reception. "Margaret, that was an incredible speech. I wanted to apologize personally for how I handled your situation at Mountain Air Rescue." "Thank you, Harrison. That means something. I was wrong about you. About experience, about judgment, about what makes a good pilot. I let corporate pressures override my better judgment." Margaret studied his face, seeing genuine remorse. "What's changed?" "Everything. Mountain Air Rescue has struggled since you left. We've had 3 incidents that could have been prevented with better judgment and experience. The board has asked me to implement new training programs based on your techniques." "That's good to hear. Margaret, I know it's probably too late, but I want you to know that you'll always have a place at Mountain Air Rescue if you want it." Margaret smiled. "I appreciate that, Harrison, but I'm exactly where I need to be." As the reception continued, Margaret found herself surrounded by young pilots eager to learn from her experience. She thought about her journey from the corporate hangar where she'd been grounded to this moment of recognition and respect. "Ms. Chen?" A young woman approached her, wearing the uniform of a regional airline. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. You've shown pilots like me that experience is something to be valued, not discarded." "What do you fly?" Margaret asked. "Right now, regional jets. But I'm hoping to transition to search and rescue. I'd love to train with your organization." Margaret handed her a business card. "Call us next week. We're always looking for pilots who understand that flying is about more than just following procedures." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself on the hotel balcony, looking out at the lights of Denver. Jake joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "How does it feel to be famous?" he asked, strange. "A year ago, I was just another pilot, facing forced retirement. Now I'm supposedly an expert on search and rescue operations." "You are an expert. You've always been an expert. The difference is that now people are listening." Margaret sipped her wine, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just accepted the administrative position at Mountain Air Rescue? Then 4 people would have died in that storm, and dozens of other lives wouldn't have been saved. You made the right choice." "Margaret, you always make the right choice." "Not always. I've made plenty of mistakes. But you've learned from them. That's what makes you a good pilot, and it's what makes you a good teacher." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Sarah. "Saw the news coverage of your speech. Dad would be so proud. Love you, Mom." Margaret smiled, thinking of her late husband and the dreams they'd shared of flying together in their golden years. He'd been gone for 10 years now, but she could still feel his presence in the cockpit during challenging flights. "What's next for CMRA?" Jake asked. "More training programs, more aircraft, more pilots. We've got requests from organizations in Alaska, Montana, and Utah. Apparently, there's a demand for pilots who aren't afraid to fly in challenging conditions. And personally, what's next for Margaret Chen? Margaret looked out at the mountains. Barely visible in the darkness. More flying, more rescues. More opportunities to prove that experience and judgment are the most important tools a pilot can have. How long do you plan to keep flying? Until I can't anymore. Until my reflexes slow down, my judgment falters, or my skills deteriorate. But that day hasn't come yet. Jake raised his glass. To Margaret Chen, who proved that being told you're too old to fly is just the beginning of the adventure. Margaret clinked her glass against his. To second chances and new beginnings. As they stood on the balcony, Margaret thought about the young pilots she'd met that evening, eager to learn from her experience. She'd spent decades accumulating knowledge and skills, and now she had the opportunity to pass them on to the next generation. The phone rang in their suite, another rescue call, another opportunity to prove that experience and judgment could overcome any obstacle. Duty calls, Jake said, recognizing the tone. Margaret finished her wine and headed for the door. Let's go save some lives. As they drove toward the airport, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her from forced retirement to national recognition. The bureaucrats had tried to ground her, but they'd only succeeded in pushing her to soar higher than ever before. At 63, Margaret Chen was just getting started. What did you think of this thrilling journey? Share your favorite moment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest tailies. What kind of story would you like to hear next?